Week 13 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few kickers I looked at off the wire this week. The first guy, Blake Grubb of the New Orleans Saints. So this Saint team all season's had trouble for the most part finding the end zone. And Blake Grubb having the best game of his career with 19 fantasy points at the Falcons in Week 8. And Grubb, for a reason, they took him in training camp over Will Lutz and traded Lutz away to the Denver Broncos. And for the most part, he's been a middle-of-the-pack type of Grubb. The last few weeks, Week 9 versus the Bears 8, Week 10 at Minnesota 4, and Week 12 at Atlanta 19. So this week here, decent matchup in Week 13 versus the Lions. Well, we know this Lion team, this could be a potential shootout between these two teams. Grubb, he's got his confidence up after hitting 5 field goals in that last ball game, putting up 19 fantasy points. And this week here versus Detroit, indoor game, obviously, which is always great. Saints back at home. I think Grubb, once again, get a few opportunities and put up some decent fantasy points. Available in 94% of fantasy leagues. Next kick is Brandon McManus of the Jacksonville Jaguars. McManus, he's been a solid kicker throughout his career with the Denver Broncos. And then after the Broncos cut him loose, he signed with the Jags in the offseason. So the last few games for McManus, Week 10 versus the Niners 3, Week 11 versus the Titans 10, and Week 12 at Houston 14. So Week 13, a good matchup versus the Bengals. Give up the 12th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So we know McManus has a good boot. We know this offense, for the most part, they wrote the ship over the last few weeks, and they're scoring mid-20s, low 30s. He kicks in a good players stadium as well, where the weather's usually nice, where you don't have to deal with a lot of elements. So this week, I give McManus an ad available in 53% of fantasy leagues. Next kick is Chris Boswell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So we know this Steelers team, they've grinded out a lot of games this season, and a lot of field goal opportunities have been there for Chris Boswell. And the last few weeks for him, Week 10 versus Green Bay 13, Week 11 at Cleveland 4, and Week 12 at Cincinnati 11. So Week 13, another good matchup versus the Arizona Cardinals, one of the worst defenses in the league, a defense you can get points on the board versus. And this Steelers offense as a whole, we know they just can't find the end zone really that much this season. So right now, Chris Boswell, he's been benefiting from it, and fantasy owners could go out there and get him right now. Well, he's available in 84% of fantasy leagues. Next kicker, Matt Gay of the Indianapolis Colts. Matt Gay, you pretty much could pencil him in anywhere from 7 to 9 fantasy points weekly as Matt Gay, because this Colts team's an offense that stalls out a lot. He's been one of the best kickers in the league over the last few seasons, getting one of the highest contracts as well of all time here from the Colts in the offseason. And he's going out there and putting up points. Week 9 at Carolina 11, Week 10 in New England 6, and Week 12 versus Tampa Bay 10. So Week 13, a great matchup at the Tennessee Titans. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So right now with a good matchup, a Tennessee defense that don't really stop anyone in terms of getting in the red zone, but they do buckle down while you're in there. So right now, Matt Gay's going to have opportunities, and his offense has trouble punching it in as well. So it all adds up for him. Available in 79% of fantasy leagues. And the final kicker I looked at off the wire, Will Lutz of the Denver Broncos. Will Lutz, he's been a good pickup right before the season for Sean Payton and this Bronco team. In the last few weeks here, Lutz has been amongst the league leaders in fantasy points at the kicking position. Week 8 versus Kansas City 6, Week 10 at Buffalo 15, Week 11 versus Minnesota 17, and Week 12 versus Cleveland 9 fantasy points. So Week 13, a good matchup at the Houston Texans, a team that plays a lot of high-scoring games for the most part. They give up a decent amount of field goals, and it's an indoor game as well, which is always a plus. So Will Lutz in this Bronco offense, they're making plays, they're getting down there, and Lutz is getting opportunities where they've stalled out a lot over the last few weeks. Available right now is Lutz, 89% of fantasy leagues. That's a few kickers I looked at off the wire for Week 13 of the fantasy football season.